At the heart of Gipuzkoa, the high valleys of the river Oria form a network of veins carrying the entire region's lifeblood, as it were, towards the city of Tolosa. Orendain is the best vantage point from which to come into first contact with this land. From here we'll see a natural triangle, whose three tips are formed by Ernio, Chindoki and Asturri. And peeking out across the valley from its balconies, a rosary of old villages of farmers and shepherds who have struggled to keep their identities intact for centuries. Villages such as tiny Bariarain that with fewer than 100 inhabitants has managed to survive unscathed to the present. The meeting points of the people in this region are also to be found suspended from the mountains, in the middle of nowhere. Gathering places such as the meadows of Thalatun, where thousands of people flock every Sunday in September to climb as a single group to the magical peak of Mount Ernio. After leaving the ancient ritual of the archers behind them, people scrabble up the side of the mountain between crosses and the rocky crags of the summit. They greet and salute one another cheerfully because, from an altitude of only 1 kilometer, they can begin to appreciate the overall picture of the complicated maze of lush valleys in which they live in almost total isolation from one another during the remainder of the year. The long, narrow shoulder of Ernio rolls eastwards in search of the valley. But on this last hump, we'll come across the old castle of Mendikuti. The fact that this ancient watchtower stands here tells us that the course of the river Oria used to be a conflictive corridor running between the kingdoms of Navarre and Castile, and that Tolosa was born precisely to control that same corridor in times of border wars. From the natural balcony of Urquizo, we would at last contemplate the complicated knots of river and ancient paths that come together in Tolosa. Centennial Tolosa is a city way whose triangular medieval heart of narrow streets is protected by the natural moat formed by the river Oria. But from the very time it was founded back in mid-13th century, Tolosa has always been a world apart. Bustling, motley city that nourishes itself off the rural surroundings in which it lives immersed, but also a city that likes to change its appearance from time to time, to both surprise itself and reveal to others that it has multiple facets. Tolosa still celebrates not only one of the oldest carnivals in the region, but also dances and military parades of armed inhabitants. Which used to be, and indeed still are, inspected by the members of the council. in order to demonstrate publicly that this indeed used to be a city whose free men and women were prepared to defend it. The pike dance, danced traditionally on the day of St. John or St. Juan, is older still. Dancers demonstrate their skills by weaving sharp pikes and halberds together. The very same weapons their ancestors had fashioned 500 years previously and which had made them famous. Amidst the music from bagpipes and kettle drums, we'll bump into giants spinning like crazy windmills that will drag us off along the streets in their irresistible wake. We will only manage to escape the flurry by turning into the Verdura or Market Square, an oasis of blooms, glass and vegetables amid the urban festivities. Here, in exactly the same way as they do in the stalls at Tinglado, the inhabitants of Tolosa become weak and allow themselves to be tempted by the best produce in the whole Basque country, such as the famous beans from Tolosa, brought in by neighbours from the region's surrounding farmhouses. They know that the only weak point the people of Tolosa have is their stomachs. So much so, in fact, that they've founded a museum containing all sorts of apparatuses used to make chocolates, cakes, biscuits, liqueurs, and all kinds of sweet whims about which they have always dreamt. They unrepentantly give themselves over to the pleasures of the flesh, especially when it's steak grilled over the hot ashes of a good grill. From kitchens to bonfires lit on the night of St. John or St. Juan, fire is an essential rite in the ancient traditions of Tolosa. But you don't have to wait for the celebrations to start, or the exceptional nights that are celebrated towards the end of the month of June. You'll find more life in any one of the numerous squares in Tolosa at any time of the day than in any other spot in the region. The first visible indication of the tremendous vitality of Tolosa was the construction of an enormous monastery in an open meadow outside the city walls some 400 years ago. This was the monastery of St. Francis or San Francisco, the forerunner of the successive extensions and enlargements the city has undergone. As Tolosa expanded, so its markets did likewise. So much so, in fact, that in 1785 a permanent structure was built between the city wall and the river, running between the gateways of Castile and Navarre to house merchants. That open shed was the origin of El Tinglado or the shed market. Tolosa has always been a well-supplied city. It never minded using some of its best spots as marketplaces, some of which are more than a century old and resemble arched galleries and passageways for pedestrians rather than marketplaces. Naturally enough, mere peasants were dazzled by such refinement and elegance. Just as they were also staggered by the colossal size of the Church of St. Mary. A dark, imposing limestone building when seen from the exterior, but whose enormous vault seemed even more impressive when seen by those walking through the church's interior columns. Standing as it did outside the city walls and hanging over the river, the palazzo or town mansion of the Diakith family was the first building to greet visitors, giving them the first impression of a city that loved the arts. Today, the streets of Tolosa are a veritable museum of metal sculptures, such as these works by brilliant artists Oteiza and Chillida that converse with the city, its present-day inhabitants, and its past history. Sculptures, such as the empty Oteiza gates giving onto the old Castile gateway, one of the 5 former entranceways the walled medieval city boasted. For many a year now, certain large pieces of public equipment simply cannot enter the old quarter of Tolosa. Accordingly, large buildings, such as the Biotiva Pelota Court, built following international rationalist criteria, were built on the road leading out of the city. Or its neighbour, the Provincial Archive building. Tolosa always wanted to be the capital city of Gipuzkoa and used to guard all the documents of the province above the church sacristy, until this huge rambling building was built to house them in an orderly fashion a century ago. Then, the Calle Mayor, or High Street, was still the most important communication thoroughfare in the entire region, the street that used to be called the Royal Navarre Highway. Tolosa became the capital city of the province in 1844, but only for 10 years. Its great arched and portal square dates from that period. The Lasquine bullring, built originally for bullfights but also used for rural sports events and tree-cutting competitions, was yet another of the buildings the inhabitants of Tolosa decided to construct a century ago to demonstrate the importance of their city. But among all the buildings from the past, none ever surpassed the sheer size of the austere convent founded by the Sisters of the Order of St. Clair, built near one of the heads of the Navarre Bridge. Other corridors are used for faster air transport, winging over its streets and rooftops. Despite the fact that there's no more flat land available for building, Tolosa has never ceased to expand. Nowadays, the city's pavements have joined with those of Ibarra. Although the square surrounding the church of St. Bartholomew's in Ibarra, still reminisces about the peaceful life it used to lead in a country town. The convent of Izaskun, perhaps the most worshipped Holy Virgin in the region, and the patron saint of thousands of women and girls scattered throughout Euskal bearing the same name, was also rebuilt in Ibarra. Now we're flying over the backbone, if you like, of the whole region, the river Oria. The river Oria has very few banks suitable for farming. It runs through a narrow corridor, and all communication highways used to run along its banks, from the Way of St. James, along which pilgrims arrived on their way from the coast, to modern motorways and roadways. we will also find trains, factories, and a rosary of increasingly scattered hamlets and villages that seem condemned to eventually join themselves together to form one single town. But the oldest dwelling places in the region weren't located at the floor of the valley, but upon mountain crests, spots such as the former settlement of Inchur, the outline of whose walls can still be seen as dark shadows under their covering blanket of grass, which dates from the Iron Age. At the foot of the settlement, standing in a tiny closed valley, lays the town of Albistur, surrounded by slopes through which limestone crags and jagged rocky teeth protrude. The Albistur of today is much smaller than the high fortress originally built some 2,500 years ago. For many centuries, Albistur shared its grazing pastures and lands with the neighboring villages of Bidania and Goiás, two hamlets that were so small they had to join together in order to survive, thus forming a new town, which was called Bidigoyan, to celebrate their union. This used to be a land famous for its stonecutters and masons, who learned their crafts without ever leaving their villages, and yet constructed such impressive stone buildings as the Palazzo or town mansion of Lithasoin. Tradition was handed down to them. As can be seen in the ancient prehistoric stone citadels. Archaeologists are currently excavating in Basque, another of the settlements with excellent panoramic views from which to survey and control the Oria corridor. But the oldest towns in the region of Tolosa are no longer found on the peaks, but on terraces built halfway up slopes, such as the town of Ernialde, whose back is shielded from the sea breezes by the mountain and whose face is bathed by the sun and the rays of light that almost never reach the valley floor. Here, every little nook and cranny holds a plot, a fruit tree, or a field that can be harvested several times a year to provide food for animals. Every scrap of land wrested from the slope was a triumph of willpower that simply cannot be given up ever again. At every shoulder on the mountain, a village. And in every village, a balcony from which to gaze out over the valley. Viewpoints, such as this one in Alquitha. All these scattered villages and farms built halfway up the mountains, some of which are nowadays being converted into rural holiday buildings, ended up joining Tolosa towards the end of the 14th century. This in fact was the origin of the term Tolosaldea, which can be translated as Tolosa and its surroundings. Asteasu, with the rolling countryside of Ubaba crowned by the church of San Pedro de Elizmendi, also had to renounce its independence for a time and begged Tolosa to include it within the city boundaries. The same thing happened with Sisurkil, absorbed by Tolosa in 1391, which didn't regain its independence until 1615, a story that was repeated time and time again in practically all the towns and villages scattered throughout Tolosa and its surroundings. The cement that bound the whole region together was fear. Fear of the powerful bands of warriors who raised the land, such as the Lazcano family, which only the then mere town of Tolosa seemed able to resist and repel. Other villages, such as Aduna for example, opted for changing their protector and gave themselves over to the protection of San Sebastian. Life was quite different on the valley floor. Here, in such heavily populated areas as Biabona, industry triumphed. Above all, the paper industry that started to shred rags in the mills of the river Oria 200 years ago and continued its expansion until practically all the available land in the entire region had been planted with pine forests to feed the paper mills. Once again, the river Oria leads us to our next port of call. Amezketa spreads over the valley floor in a narrow section between mountains, which is why its old quarter had to form itself around the church of San Juan. The church of San Miguel in neighbouring Irura is very similar to the church in Amezketa, possibly because the past of both towns is so remarkably similar, although Irura didn't fight for its independence quite so heartily. The Ronde-Var highway used to run through Berastegi on its way to the coast. When municipal laws were passed in Gipuzkoa more than 150 years ago, Berastegi had so few inhabitants, it asked Tolosa if it would continue to represent it at the General Council meetings, because it simply didn't have enough money to pay its own legal representative. If we travel up the river Thalai, we'll reach El Duain, a deceptive town indeed, because though it has fewer than 250 inhabitants, its municipal boundaries are very extensive indeed. In fact, it's one of the largest municipalities in Gipuzkoa. Its lands even extend so far as the great valley of Leitharan. A practically untouched land in which the lively waters of the river Leitharan mark the eastern boundary of the region. The old train that used to transport labourers from Navarre wanting to travel to San Sebastian used to run along this meandering, tree-lined track. The railway, aqueducts and waterfalls are signs that industry also dominated this uninhabited valley, although it has been almost completely forgotten again nowadays. To the rear, Mount Usture, the great domestic mountain for the inhabitants of Tolosa, an almost 800-meter high peak whose slopes ascend directly from the city, offering the perfect lookout point over the entire region. Maybe it was from the peak of Mount Usturre that the inhabitants of Tolosa first witnessed the approach of Navarre troops, marching on the fertile lands of Beotiba at the foot of Balanza in 1321. This early sighting gave them enough time to ambush and defeat the troops in a fratricidal battle that has, from that moment on, converted itself into the one battle in the town's history about which its inhabitants feel proudest. Let's fly now to the east. Berastegi is the most eastern of the 28 villages in the region. The church of San Martin lies at the center of this high valley. The Berastegi family used to hold sway over this church, and indeed over all the valley's inhabitants. Though the remains of the ancient tower alongside the church are no more than a pale, faded shadow of their former might. Mule teams traveling from Pamplona used to consider the main thoroughfare through the town of Berastegi as the gateway to Guipúzcoa. As we approach the boundary of Navarre, so the farmhouses change their appearances. Buildings become taller and shadier, such as those found in the Gaztelu meadows, a far cry indeed from the whitewashed valley farms. An imaginary line joins the churches of Gaztelu and San Pedro de Alburo, running over farm rooftops protected with crosses to keep them safe from lightning and other threats from heaven. Villages such as Oria, in which cattle raising and forestry have carried much more specific weight than farming, an activity that is practically impossible to pursue due to the steep slopes that plunge downwards to the riverbed. Lisatsa can be found slightly lower down. Lisatsa stands on a tight bend of the river Araxes, from where it dominates the only possible access. The town itself is like a padlock that stops people from negotiating the dark green defile leading to the mountain passes of Lecumberri and the heart of Navarre. To the south, searching for the sun, we'll find the meadows of Bidayo. This is where the empty shell of the Grubilla Aundi farmhouse in which 6 families of lowly farm workers live, and one of the largest farmhouses in the whole of Euskal at the same time. Bidayo is a small island chained to Tolosa on the foothills of Mount Arala. It was the only town in the region that never managed to gain its own independence. A town town that continues to stand imperturbably before the menacing hulk of Mount Balerdi. Villages to the bottom of the valley, such as Alegia, managed to purchase their freedom in 1615, board the money train and take full advantage of the fact that visitors and pilgrims used to cross its bridges and stroll its streets that were becoming increasingly longer and better populated. Nearby, we'll discover the oldest founded church in Gipuzkoa, San Salvador de Alzo, in addition to which this particular site is linked to the first mention ever of Gipuzkoa in a written document. That was 1,000 years ago, when this region used to be called Gipuzkoa. Some of the most beautiful farm buildings made of stone and oak in the whole of Euskal can be found near Alzo Muño. Legendary beings were born in this world. Characters such as Miguel Berastegi, the so-called giant of Ipinza, who with his height of 2 meters and 40 centimeters was the tallest person in Europe in the middle of the 19th century. He visited all the European courts, astonishing both royalty and Emperor Napoleon III alike. Let's continue south. Amezketa is the most southern village in Tolosa. Located at the bottom of an apparent cul-de-sac, the village is, in fact, a key crossing point between the high grazing pastures on Mount Arala and the lowlands. Flocks still wend their way along the foothills of San Bartolomé as they pass by every year. Let's start to ascend. Until we reach Amezketa, a privileged lookout point set on a bare, steep hill. The entire high river basin of River Oria that flows northwards in its search for the sea stretches out before it. It is also the last step for climbing the mountain range. But an old guardian is observing us. The Castle of Ausa. Built by Navars with its walled square and circular lookout tower at an altitude of almost 1,000 meters in the 12th century to protect access to the villages and hamlets of Goyeri and the grazing meadows of Mount Arala. This was the key to the mountains. In these mountains, shepherding is an uninterrupted millinery tradition. A way of life that sinks its roots downwards, back to dark prehistoric ages, an activity that is considered vastly differently by valley and town dwellers. Such spots as the pens of Anilio, the megalithic tombs of warrior shepherds from thousands of years ago, live peacefully alongside the huts and shelters of the last shepherds to live in the Goyeri region of Tolosa. These are the deepest roots in the region, the ones that have lasted longest, the ones that are on the verge of disappearing completely. As flocks fill the grazing areas that have provided food for all their species, so we start our ascent to the summit. This is the last peak, Mount Chindoki, the ceiling, if you like, of the region of Tolosa, the symbolically representative mountain of Gipuzkoa and the most beautiful and finest ridge in all Euskal. This is the peak where Mari, the mother goddess of nature, abides permanently at an altitude of more than 1,200 meters, a peak upon which men are nothing but passing guests. This is where the earth finishes and the sky begins.